Okay, so now we move to the fun part, the part that we all love about the recruitment process, and one that we've often done a lot more of from the other side of the desk than from the manager's side of the desk, if you will. All right, and that is the interview process, and we all love it, job interviews, okay? Everyone loves applying for them and coming along, and everyone loves giving them. Actually, the exact opposite is generally the case for a lot of people. All right, but what an interview really is just, it's a guided talk, okay? So interview sounds all very busy, but it's actually just a guided talk. Okay, we want to have a discussion with a person to make an assessment, okay? We just want to find out who this person is and how do they fit with what we want to do. All right, that's really the purpose of having an interview. Okay, it's an organizational fit conversation. And that's made most effective by making sure that we've got a well-designed, well-thought-out, and well-prepared interview guide, okay? So the more organized we get, the better that's gonna be. Okay, key part of that, be organized. Okay, don't just go off and wing it and think of the top 20 questions you wanna ask someone. Have a consistent approach, have it mapped out, well-organized in advance, so this is as painless as possible and is the most fruitful it can be. Remember, you've only got a certain amount of time, you want to invest it wisely. All right, so really the interview comes down to three main phases. And the first phase that I start thinking about then is my preparation phase. Okay, so how am I going to prepare for this interview? Okay, because I'm going to have a bunch of people come in, I'm going to have to ask them some questions. I need to start thinking early about, well, how's this going to work? Okay, so when we talk about preparation, we also need to think about, well, what's the schedule? Okay, so when are we interviewing them? Where are we interviewing them? What are we going to ask them? How's it going to happen? And on what time frame? The next part is the execution phase. Okay, where I move into actually doing this now. Okay, so I need to go, let's go and conduct them. Okay, so I've scheduled, I then conduct, and then at the end of it, I need to start thinking about some sort of selection. Okay, so choose. Okay, I need to eventually get to some sort of choice and, start thinking about, well, how's this work? What's the engagement? What's the non-engagement of the process? Okay, so have people come along, what sort of response did I get, etc. Make my selection based on that, and then do the review phase. Okay, it's where I'm doing the overview of how the process went. Did I get the right person? Am I happy with the way everything went? Did I allow enough time for interviews? Did this thing work? Okay, so that's just my review stage. Once again, we're always trying to continuously improve our process to make sure that we can quicker and more effectively get to the right person and the right job. So to go back to the interview schedule, okay, so this scheduling portion, we need to think about, well, what are the objectives of the candidate interviews? Okay, so what are we trying to achieve here? What information do I need to get out of them? What areas I need to cover in the interview? So what do I need to ask them about? What do they need to bring? How does this need to play out on the ground? Okay, so do I need a demonstration? What's going to happen here? I want to make sure I've got a schedule so I know what time and what place things are going to happen. Okay, I want to make sure that everyone is advised of that because it might not just be me who's doing the interviews or you. You might be thinking about, well, who else needs to be a part of that interview? Does this need to be an interview panel? Do you want to have 3 people do the interviews, each asking different sets of questions, okay? So you've got a schedule there, and then we need to make sure that those are all written down, they're booked appropriately, and they're diarised, okay? Nothing worse than people missing times and dates, etc. Stuff just ends up all over the place. Part of that is also a good plan for that is to make sure you've got an interview guide, okay? Remember, this is a guided talk, in which case we make a guide, even if it's a piece of paper through to a fairly large comprehensive guide. And in that guide, what we're looking for is what are the objectives of the interview? So why are we doing this process? In other words, are we looking to fill a position or, how's this working? Who are we looking for? What are we looking for? When do we need them to start? All that sort of key stuff. What's the structure of the interview? Is it just going to be a bunch of Q&A sessions? Is it going to be questions and answers followed by a demonstration, followed by more questions? Okay, what's going to actually take place and make sure that that's diarised so you know how long it's supposed to take? Because at some point, we're probably going to need to tell the applicant, yeah, you're going to be here for 30 minutes or this is going to be half a day. Okay, so once again, you want to be able to let them know what they're in for, nice and easy and nice and early. You need to prepare your questions in advance. Okay, so the key part of this is consistency and transparency, that they know precisely, that everyone gets asked the same questions. And in some places, they actually put out the interview questions in advance. In other words, what you really want is the person to come prepared for the interview, able to talk to the questions you've got. Now remember, an interview is a bit of a funky, weird sort of scenario. They're coming in, there's a lot of stress, and sometimes people, you can have the right person, but they're just nervous and they're going to give you an answer that's a little bit weird. But if they've had time to prepare a really good case for you, they can sometimes pitch that in a much better way, okay? So rather than off the cuff. Some people, they're great people, they just don't do well in interview questions. So have a think about how you want to approach that. Once again, there's no right way. There's just a bunch of different considerations. You weigh up the ones that work for you. And the other thing is you might, at that stage, in your preparation phase, think about any other notes that you might need to make. Have an organizational chart ready for them, because they're obviously going to start having some questions for you. Okay, you've obviously prepared the questions for them, but there's some obvious stuff that they might be asking you that you might need to start coming up with. So where do they fit into the team? Where will I be working? Can I meet the people? Do you have any information on that? Is there any takeaway? So all that stuff that they're likely to ask, get that together, and any clarification of roles and responsibilities. Even within the people that are going to do the interview, who is going to be asking what question? All right, the next thing that we need to start to think about as well is the structure. All right, now what we need to do is when we structure the interview, we want to make sure that the candidates get to a point where they're answering the questions that we need. And that's part of this preparation as well. Because sometimes if you've got an interview guide that asks a question that's ambiguous, the candidate can start going off on a tangent and answering something entirely different. And what will happen is if you can't get them back on track, your 30-minute tight, beautiful interview that you had planned turns into an hour-and-a-half extravaganza. And I've certainly been subjected to that an interview I went to for half an hour, the interviewer went off on a tangent. And before I knew it, my interview that I thought was going to be, I was going to be having a conversation with someone for 30 minutes, ended up a 90-minute conversation where they gave me a full breakdown of the company and a whole pile of details. It was interesting, I loved it, but probably wasn't really what we were doing at the interview, okay? So that would have been better for the orientation if I get the role, as opposed to tell everyone. As we say, it just chews up massive amounts of time. So the interviewer needs to be prepared for what the boundaries are so that they can either get the interviewee back on track or to make sure they put a bit of a cap on what they need to know today and they don't get drawn into or start conversations outside the mandate of the interview. Okay, so once again, at the beginning of the interview, you might start with the very specific yay, nay questions just to sort of get the flow going and then move into the more open stuff. But if you start with a lot of open questions, things can get really funky early, so better to structure it that, the more fixed questions at the beginning and then the more open questions at the end. Okay, so think about how they're going to go that way. With regards to those questions, make sure they're quantifiable, okay? So, you need to get down to numbers, yay, nay, etc. We're trying to get to a bit of a flow, get that early stuff out of the way. If you start to get into open questions, it really opens up. They can answer it anyway, and it gets really hard to compare. So if you say, it's a little bit hard, but why do you want this job? Well, that sounds, I've got 5 people all going to give me 5 different answers. Well, how do I rate one against the other? They're not really quantifiable. I can't measure them up against each other very easily. Okay, but what we're looking for is a consistent outcome in our questions to get a fairly fixed set of answers, so I can put this candidate against that candidate and equally judge them. If they both go off in totally different directions, it's really hard to make that comparison. So try and keep it sort of neat, at least in the early stage of the interview, to give you some good comparison points. Okay. We also need to make sure that any guide or schedule that we put together is also complete and accurate, and make sure that we give it to one of the other people that are going to be involved in the interview process so they can have a look over it as well and see once again if you've missed anything. Once again, we know what we meant, but sometimes if we don't write everything down, you don't want to get to the interview and either miss something and have to call the person back, which is really embarrassing, or realize that you got to the end of the process and you actually didn't answer or have asked a critical question that you really, really needed to know. Okay, so once again creates problems. So get someone to check your stuff before you use it. Always get someone to double check your stuff. We get tired, we sometimes lose the plot, make sure you get it checked.